The Zynar Empire stretched across half the galaxy. Its fleets moved like waves of steel, and its banners flew over 1,000 conquered worlds. At the heart of this empire was Queen Nira, a ruler both admired and feared. Her people saw her as the living symbol of power, the mind that never faltered and the hand that never trembled. She had fought battles since her youth and had stood firm against enemies who tried to crush her throne. For the alien races across the stars, the Zynar Queen was a legend. She was tall, regal, and sharp-eyed, her voice carrying the weight of command. She was known for her discipline, for her focus, and for the cold fire in her heart. Yet behind the golden crown and the endless halls of her palace, Nira carried a weight she never admitted to anyone. Every empire, no matter how strong, had cracks. She saw the signs of wear within her fleets. She heard the whispers of doubt in her council, and she felt the pressure of being the one who had to hold everything together. It was in those days of quiet unease that a new figure entered her life. His name was Aaron. He was not from a world of warriors, not from a planet filled with towering machines or endless fleets. He came from Earth, a young species that had only recently stepped into the stars. Compared to the great civilizations of the galaxy, humans were newcomers, a people regarded as weak, unpredictable, and short-lived. When Nira first met Aaron, she thought little of him. He was not strong like her generals. He did not carry the wisdom of her oldest advisors. He had no grand fleet or ancient bloodline to his name. He simply stood with a calm presence, looking at her with clear eyes that seemed to see her not only as a queen but also as a person. That alone unsettled her, for few dared to look at her that way. The Empire's court was filled with shock when she announced Iran as her consort. The nobles muttered in disbelief. The council whispered in the shadows. Why would the great Queen Nira tie herself to a human? To them, it was almost an insult. They believed the queen had chosen weakness, a fragile being unworthy of standing by her side. Many expected the union to fail, to be nothing more than a passing whim. But Nira was not careless in her choices. She saw something in Iran that others could not. He was quiet, yet every word he spoke had thought behind it. He listened when others shouted. He asked questions that made even her most trusted generals pause. His way of thinking was unlike the structured minds of her people. Humans, she realized, did not measure strength only by weapons or armies. They measured it by how they endured, how they adapted, and how they found meaning in the darkest of times. The early days of their bond were not easy. In the Grand Palace, Aaron was treated as an outsider. Servants lowered their voices when he passed. Courtiers laughed behind his back. Soldiers regarded him as little more than decoration, a fragile companion chosen out of curiosity by their queen. Even in the council chamber, his suggestions were dismissed before he could finish speaking. Yet Aaron did not rise to anger. Instead, he walked the palace halls with patience. He studied the ways of the Zynar. He learned their history, their victories, and their losses. He asked questions no one else dared to ask, not to challenge, but to understand. Slowly, Nira began to notice that in moments when her counsel was stuck, Aaron's quiet observations often lit a path forward. One evening, after a long day of council disputes, Nira walked with Aaron through the royal gardens. The sky above was a sea of stars, and the towers of the palace glowed with silver light. She asked him why he never defended himself against the whispers and insults. Aaron smiled, his eyes calm. Power does not come from answering every word, he said. It comes from knowing which words matter and which ones can fade away. Your people fear weakness, but sometimes patience is the greatest strength of all. Nira was silent for a long time. She had fought wars and broken armies, yet she had never thought of patience as strength. In Aaron's words, she saw a different kind of power, one that her empire had overlooked for centuries. Over the months, the bond between them deepened. Aaron's presence, once doubted, began to soften the queen's endless weight. She found herself speaking to him of worries she could not share with her council. He did not always have answers, but he listened with a sincerity she had rarely known. His way of seeing her not only as a queen but as a woman who carried burdens made her feel less alone in her throne. The empire's people, however, remained unconvinced. Rumors spread through the fleets that their queen had been blinded by strange affection. Some feared that her choice would weaken their standing among rival empires. Others simply could not understand what a human could offer. To them, Aaron remained a mystery, one they did not care to solve. But then came the moment that revealed the truth of his bond with Nira. A small border dispute flared near the edge of the empire, where a rebellious warlord tried to seize control of a star system. The council argued for days about how many fleets to send. They debated the risks, the supplies, and the cost of open war. Nira listened in silence as voices clashed, but her eyes drifted toward Iran, who sat quietly at the edge of the chamber. When she asked his view, the council erupted in protest. How could a human speak on matters of war? But Nira raised her hand, silencing the chamber. Aaron spoke softly, yet every word was sharp. He asked the generals not about their ships, but about the warlord's supply lines. He asked how long the warlord's forces could hold without access to trade routes. The room grew still as the council realized none of them had considered it. By focusing not on force but on the simple truth of resources, Aaron offered a plan that could end the conflict without endless bloodshed. That evening, Nira found herself staring at him in wonder. He had seen what her seasoned generals had missed. He had asked questions no one else thought to ask, and he had done it without pride or arrogance, simply with the calm clarity that came so naturally to him. For the first time in her long reign, Nira felt the stir of something she had never known in battle or in conquest. She felt respect for a man not because of his armies or his bloodline, but because of his mind and his spirit. In Aaron, she saw the possibility of a strength the galaxy had overlooked. As the stars burned above the empire, the whispers in the court continued, but Nira no longer cared. She had chosen her human husband not for the approval of others, but because she had glimpsed in him something rare. He was not like her generals or her nobles. He was something entirely different, and it was that difference that made him precious. The galaxy saw only a fragile human. The queen began to see something far greater. Far beyond the borders of the Zynar Empire, hidden in the cold reaches of space, something stirred. The stars of that region were dim, and ancient ruins floated between them, reminders of wars long forgotten. In the silence of that void, the Kraylan swarm gathered. They were not like the Zynar, who built cities of shining stone, nor like humans who sought meaning and discovery. The Kraylan were a tide of hunger, moving from system to system, stripping everything until only dust remained. The swarm had been silent for generations. Many in the Empire thought they were gone, broken by time, but Queen Nira had always suspected they would return. She had studied their old battles, their strange weapons, and their way of fighting. When her scouts brought news of destroyed outposts at the edge of the Empire, her fears sharpened. The Kraylan had awakened once more. Inside the Grand Council chamber, voices clashed like storms. Generals argued over numbers. Ministers feared the loss of trade. Some wanted to send the largest fleet to crush the threat quickly. Others warned that doing so would leave the Empire's heart unprotected. The chamber grew louder with every passing moment, and even the Queen's calm presence could not silence them all. Aaron sat at the side of the chamber. His place was near the Queen, but away from the circle of power. To most, he was still only a human, a guest from a young world. He listened as the argument spun in circles. His eyes followed the glowing star maps that floated in the air, and he noticed details the others ignored. He did not speak, for he knew his words would be brushed aside. But Queen Nira noticed his gaze. She saw how his eyes followed not the fleets but the empty lines of space between them. She saw him studying the trade routes, the forgotten paths that linked the Empire together. Her generals shouted of strength and numbers, but Aaron was silent, as if searching for a truth none of them could see. When the chamber fell quiet for a moment, Nira turned her eyes toward him. "Aaron," she said, her voice steady, "what do you see?" The council erupted in protest. "Your Majesty, this is no matter for him," one general cried. "He is not trained in war." Another minister spoke sharply. "He is not even of our kind. His people have no empire. How can he speak of strategy?" But Nira raised her hand and the chamber fell silent again. Her eyes did not leave Aaron. He rose slowly, his voice calm when he spoke. "I see lines you do not watch. You speak of fleets, of weapons, of power. But all armies need food. All ships need fuel. All soldiers need rest. You see the swarm as a tide, but a tide flows because something feeds it. Where does their strength come from? How do they move so far, so fast?" The room grew uneasy. None had asked such questions. They had spoken only of force against force, never of what sustained the enemy. Aaron pointed at the map. "The outposts they destroyed lie along forgotten routes. These routes are not important for battle, but they are rich in resources. If the swarm follows these lines, it means they take what they need as they move. Cut those lines and you weaken them before the war even begins. The generals looked at one another. It was a simple idea, yet none of them had spoken it. The silence that followed was heavier than the shouts that had filled the chamber before. Queen Nera's eyes narrowed, thoughtful. She saw the wisdom in his words, but she also saw the discomfort in her counsel. They did not like being taught by a human. She knew they would resist, not because his idea lacked strength, but because it came from someone they did not value. After the council ended, Nera walked with Aaron through the palace halls. The glow of distant suns filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the floor. She turned to him and asked, "Where did you learn to think like this?" Aaron gave a quiet smile. "On Earth, we had no empires. We had to survive with little. We learned to see what others missed. We asked simple questions because simple questions often hide the hardest truths." Nera studied him carefully. His voice carried no pride, only honesty. She realized then that his strength was not in commanding armies, but in looking where others refused to look. He was not blinded by tradition or pride. That, she thought, made him dangerous in ways her enemies could never expect. Days passed, and reports from the border grew worse. More colonies were destroyed. Survivors spoke of ships that moved like storms, creatures that attacked without fear. The Empire's people began to panic. Markets trembled, soldiers grew restless, and whispers of the swarm's return spread like fire. In the midst of this unrest, Nera called for a private meeting with her closest commanders. Aaron stood with her, silent but watchful. Maps filled the chamber once more, showing how the swarm advanced. One general struck his fist on the table. "We must meet them head-on. If we show weakness, they will sweep across the Empire." Another shook her head. "If we throw our fleets into battle too soon, we risk losing everything. We must defend the core and wait for their strength to fade." Again the room divided, each voice louder than the last. Finally Nera's voice cut through the noise. "Enough, we cannot fight as before. The swarm expects brute force. They expect us to meet them in open battle. That is what they prepare for. We must think differently." Her eyes shifted toward Aaron. "And I believe we already have a path." The generals stiffened, but none dared to speak against their queen. She gestured for Aaron to step forward. Aaron looked at the star map. "They are not endless. They move along lines that feed them. Strike those lines, and you force them to slow. Make them desperate. A desperate enemy makes mistakes. We cannot match them with numbers, but we can make their strength turn against them." The generals exchanged uneasy glances. The plan was simple, almost too simple, yet its truth was hard to deny. Queen Nera stood tall. "We will not throw lives away in pointless battles. We will fight with precision. We will make the swarm bleed by taking away what they need most. This is the path we will take." The decision was made. Fleets were prepared not for grand battles, but for sudden strikes. Supply routes were mapped, hidden stations were uncovered, and scouts were sent to shadow the swarm. For the first time, the Empire moved not with its usual show of force, but with careful silence. Still, doubt lingered among the people. Rumors spread that their queen had been swayed by her human consort. Some said Aaron was a weakness that would doom them all. Others whispered that perhaps the queen had seen something the rest could not. Aaron himself ignored the whispers. He walked the palace as he always had, quiet and calm. Yet inside he felt the weight of what was to come. He knew the Kraylan were not a simple enemy. He knew they would test not only the Empire but also the bond between himself and the queen. One night, as the stars burned bright above the palace, Aaron stood on a balcony, gazing at the endless sky. Nera joined him, her steps silent. She looked at him, her eyes steady. "You have given me a path," she said. "But when the storm comes, words will not be enough. Will you stand with me when the fire falls?" Aaron turned to her, his voice firm. "I did not come here to stand in shadows. When the fire comes, I will be at your side." For the first time in many years, Queen Nera allowed herself a small smile. In the silence of that night, she felt something stir within her heart. Not fear, not doubt, but hope. The shadows in the stars were growing stronger, but so too was the bond that might one day save them all. The first strikes against the Kraylan swarm began quietly. Xynar fleets moved through forgotten passages in space, avoiding the main routes where the enemy's power grew strongest. Instead of meeting the swarm head-on, they cut supply stations, destroyed hidden harvesters, and severed the paths that carried food and fuel to the endless tide. At first, the swarm did not notice. Their ships still pushed forward, their warriors still consumed worlds, but slowly cracks appeared. Fleets moved slower, colonies fell silent, and frustration spread through their ranks. For the first time in centuries, the Kralin met resistance they had not expected. In the heart of the Xinar Palace, Queen Nira received reports each day. She listened to the voices of her generals and measured the weight of every victory and loss. Yet even with small successes, she knew the storm had not yet truly fallen. The swarm was vast, and their hunger would not be stopped by simple strikes. They would adapt, and when they did, the Empire would face its greatest trial. Aaron stood beside her during every meeting. His voice was not loud, but his presence carried calm through the room. When generals argued, he asked the quiet questions that drew their thoughts back to focus. When fear spread, his steady gaze reminded them that not all was lost. Still, many doubted him. To them, he was only a human, a strange consort who spoke of patience while the galaxy trembled. The true test came sooner than expected. A cluster of outposts near the star known as Naren fell within days. Survivors spoke of a vast armada, larger than anything seen before. The swarm had stopped holding back. They poured their strength forward in a wave that burned through defenses like fire through dry grass. The council rushed into panic. Generals shouted for every fleet to gather at once. Ministers cried of colonies that could not be abandoned. The chamber shook with fear until Queen Nira rose from her throne. Her voice cut through the storm. "We will not be broken by fear. We will not scatter like dust. If the swarm comes in force, then we must meet them not with numbers but with fire of our own choosing." She turned her eyes to Aaron. "You have given us a path before. Tell us what must be done now." The room fell silent, though unease rippled through the generals. Aaron stepped forward slowly. His eyes scanned the map of the Naren region. He saw the swarm's strength, a line of ships stretching like a storm across the stars. He saw the fragile outposts ahead of them, too weak to stand alone. Then he looked at the empty spaces between, the forgotten currents of space that others overlooked. "They expect us to defend every colony," Aaron said. "They want us to scatter our fleets until we are weak. But if we let them think they have broken us, if we draw them deeper along their own path, we can strike at the heart of their command." A murmur swept through the room. The generals frowned. To lure the swarm deeper was to risk losing whole systems. Yet in Aaron's voice there was no doubt, only calm certainty. Queen Nira's gaze never wavered. "You speak of a trap," Aaron nodded. "Yes, let them believe they are winning. Let them stretch their lines until they cannot protect them all. Then we strike where it matters most." The council debated long into the night. Many resisted, but the Queen's authority carried weight. In the end, the plan was accepted. The Empire would not fight the swarm everywhere. Instead, it would prepare the ground for one decisive blow. The fleets moved as ordered. Some colonies were evacuated, their people carried away under the cover of darkness. Others were strengthened in secret, turned into hidden fortresses. The swarm advanced, confident in their strength, unaware that every step pulled them closer to the trap. For Aaron, the days were heavy. He walked the palace halls and felt the eyes of those who doubted him. He knew that if the plan failed, blame would fall on him, and perhaps even on the Queen who trusted him. Yet he carried the weight without fear. He had been raised to believe that survival came not from strength alone, but from clarity, from seeing what others missed. And here, among the stars, that belief would be tested more than ever before. When the swarm finally reached the Naren cluster, the Empire was ready. Fleets rose to meet them, but not in full strength. Instead, small groups of ships struck quickly, then vanished into hidden paths. The swarm pressed forward, tearing down defenses, convinced that victory was near. But with every step, their supply lines grew thinner. With every world consumed, they stretched further into the trap. Then the moment came. From hidden passages, the Xinar fleet surged, striking not at the endless warriors of the swarm, but at their command vessel, the great hive ship that directed their tide. The battle that followed shook the stars. The hive ship was vast, its weapons fierce, and the swarm fought with blind fury to protect it. Yet Aaron's plan had cut their strength before the fight began. Their supply lines were broken, their movements slowed, and their fleets uncoordinated. For the first time, the swarm fought not as a tide but as scattered fragments. Aaron himself was aboard one of the lead strike ships. Though not a soldier, he refused to remain in the safety of the palace. He stood on the bridge, guiding the attack through the paths he had studied. His eyes followed every movement of the hive ship, predicting its strikes, guiding the fleet where to press and where to retreat. The crew looked to him with awe, for though he had no training of their kind, his vision carried them through fire. On the surface of one of Naren's moons, Queen Nira led her own warriors in battle. Her voice carried through the ranks like steel, her presence a beacon even in the chaos. Yet even she felt a tremor of surprise when messages from the fleet told of Iran's calm command, of his ability to see the pattern of the enemy where others saw only storm. At last, the hive ship faltered. Its shields cracked, its weapons slowed, and the Empire's fire poured into its heart. With one final strike, it fell in flames, breaking apart into burning fragments that lit the sky of Naren. The swarm shuddered. Without the command vessel, their tide lost its unity. Some ships fled into the dark, others turned to reckless destruction, but the great wave that had threatened the Empire was broken. When the battle ended, the stars were quiet again. The Xenar had won, though at great cost. Many colonies were gone, fleets were damaged, and lives were lost. Yet the heart of the Empire still beat, and the swarm had been pushed back. In the aftermath, whispers spread across the Empire. Soldiers spoke of the Queen's fire and of the human who had guided them through the storm. They began to see Eren not as weakness but as a strange new kind of strength. He had stood in the test of fire and had not broken. In the palace, Queen Nira met him again. She looked at him with steady eyes, her voice low but filled with meaning. "You said patience could be strength," she told him. "Now I see that it is true. You gave us the path and you stood with us when the fire came. The Empire owes you more than it will ever admit." Eren shook his head. "It was not me alone. It was your courage, your people's will. I only helped them see the path." Nira's gaze softened, though her voice remained firm. "Perhaps. But it is clear now that the galaxy does not yet understand what humans carry within them. You are more than the fragile image they believe. You are fire hidden in quiet words." For a long moment they stood in silence, the light of distant stars casting shadows across the room. Both knew the war was not over. The swarm would return and other enemies waited in the dark. But both also knew something greater had been revealed. The test of fire had shown not only the strength of the Empire, but the hidden power of humanity, a power that even the Queen herself had only begun to see. The Battle of Naren had ended with victory, but the Empire knew peace would not last. The Kraylan swarm had suffered a heavy blow, yet they were not destroyed. Reports came from distant scouts that scattered groups of the enemy were gathering again. Without their great hive ship, they were disorganized, but their hunger still burned. Inside the palace, Queen Nira stood before her war council. Her generals reported losses, rebuilding efforts, and the need for stronger defenses. Ministers spoke of trade routes cut by war, of colonies that needed aid. The room was heavy with tension. Eren sat at her side, listening. He could see the fear hidden beneath the surface. The Empire had survived, but it was shaken. If the swarm struck again, and if the Empire was not ready, the victory at Naren would mean little. One general leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Your Majesty, we must build greater fleets. Only sheer power can hold them back. The swarm will return with more ships, and we must be ready to meet them with overwhelming fire." Another shook her head. "Our strength is not endless. We cannot match them ship for ship. If we waste all resources on war, our people will starve. We need another way." Arguments filled the chamber again, just as they had before. Nira raised her hand, but this time she did not silence them. Instead, she turned her eyes toward Iran. "Tell me," she said softly, "what does your eye see that ours do not?" The room stilled. Some frowned, others looked away, but all waited for him to speak. Eren stood slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "The swarm is strong, yes, but strength can blind. They expect us to fight them the same way every time. They expect fleets and walls and battles of numbers. That is why they are dangerous, but also why they can be beaten. Humanity has lived for ages without being the strongest. We had no claws, no armor, no wings. We survived by using what we had, by turning weakness into advantage. That is what we must do now." He stepped to the glowing map of the galaxy. His hand pointed at the paths the swarm had taken. "They do not understand unpredictability. They move like a tide, steady and crushing, but a tide can be outmaneuvered if one is fast, flexible, and willing to take risks. We must fight them not as an empire of stone, but as a hunter who adapts to every move." The generals exchanged uncertain glances. His words were strange to them, yet they stirred thought. Queen Nira leaned forward, her eyes sharp. You speak of something more than defense. You speak of striking them where they do not expect. Aaron nodded. Yes, small strike teams. Fast, precise. We do not fight their numbers head on. We strike at their heart again and again until they cannot rise. This is the human way of survival. Not overwhelming strength, but endurance, persistence, and surprise. The council debated for hours. Many resisted. To send small teams against the swarm sounded reckless. Yet others remembered the victory at Naren. The trap that had worked only because Aaron had seen what they had not. Slowly, one by one, the voices shifted. Finally, Queen Nira rose. Her voice was firm, carrying through the chamber. We will not become prisoners of fear. We will not waste ourselves in endless battles. We will take the human path. We will strike with precision, with courage, and with fire they cannot predict. The decision was made. Plans were drawn. Small groups of ships were chosen, each led by skilled warriors. Their task was not to hold ground but to strike deep into enemy space, to cut supply nodes, destroy breeding nests, and weaken the swarm from within. When the time came, Aaron did not remain behind. He volunteered to lead one of the teams himself. The council was shocked. Some called it foolish, others dangerous, but Nira allowed it. She saw the fire in his eyes, the same fire that had guided them through Naren. If humanity's strength was unpredictability, then Aaron himself was its living proof. The strike fleet was small, a handful of ships. They moved through hidden passages, avoiding patrols until they reached the dark heart of swarm territory. The void there was filled with broken planets and hollow moons, stripped bare by endless hunger. On the command deck, Aaron stood beside the Xenar captain. His eyes scanned every sensor, every flicker of light on the map. He gave no orders of pride, only calm instructions. Wait here, move now. Strike there. His voice was steady, and the crew began to trust him, though at first they had doubted the human beside them. The mission was dangerous. The swarm's ships were vast, their weapons terrible. Yet Aaron's mind worked differently. Where others saw walls, he saw paths. Where others thought of retreat, he thought of turning weakness into bait. Again and again he led them through battles where they should have been destroyed, and again they emerged alive. On the fourth day they reached a hidden nest. The swarm had built it inside a hollow planet, using its tunnels as breeding grounds for new warriors. To destroy it would mean striking deep into enemy defenses. Many thought it impossible. Aaron studied the map in silence, then spoke. They do not expect us here. That is our chance. If we strike fast before they gather, we can end this nest before it fills the stars. The crew followed. They slipped through cracks in the enemy's patrol, diving into the hollow world. Inside, the nest spread like fire, glowing with strange energy. Warriors swarmed toward them, shrieking with hunger. The battle that followed was fierce. Xenar soldiers fought in narrow tunnels, blades and rifles flashing in the dark. Aaron himself moved with them, not as a soldier but as a leader who saw patterns in chaos. He guided them through side paths, used tunnels to trap enemies, and turned every weakness into strength. At last they reached the core of the nest. Explosives were placed, charges set. As the swarm closed in from every side, Aaron gave the final command. The soldiers fled back through the tunnels, and behind them the world shook. The hollow planet burst apart in fire, its nest reduced to dust. The fleet escaped into the void, battered but alive. They had done what many thought impossible. When they returned to the Empire, word of their success spread faster than fire. Soldiers who had once doubted the human now spoke of him with respect. They told of how he had guided them, how his strange way of thinking had saved them when all seemed lost. Across the Empire, whispers grew into belief. Queen Nira received him in the Grand Hall. She looked at him not only as her husband but as the one who had shown her people a path they could never have found alone. You have given them something more than victory, she said. You have given them a new way to fight, a new way to see themselves. This is the human edge, and it is sharper than any blade. Aaron bowed his head. It is not me alone. It is the spirit of my people. We survive not because we are strongest, but because we refuse to fall. That is the gift humanity carries. Nira's eyes held his. Then let it be the gift that saves us all. The Empire was still at war, the swarm still a threat. But something had changed. No longer did the Xenar see humans as fragile. They saw them as different, as carriers of a strength hidden not in weapons but in spirit. And in the heart of that change stood Aaron, the human who had turned doubt into fire and fear into courage. The Empire stood in uneasy silence after the destruction of the swarm's nest. For the first time in memory, the endless tide of the Kralin had been struck not by brute force but by cunning, and it had worked. Across the stars, soldiers and citizens whispered of the human who had stood beside their queen. Whispers turned to stories, and stories turned to belief. In the palace, Queen Nira listened as reports arrived. The swarm had pulled back to the edges of known space. Their movements were scattered, their hunger slowed. But Nira knew the truth. This was not the end. The swarm was a force born of instinct and need. They would not vanish because of one defeat. They would learn, adapt, and return. She stood at the tall windows of her throne room, gazing out at the star-filled sky. The Empire had endured wars before, yet this was different. The battles against the Kralin had revealed not only the enemy's strength, but also something hidden within her own people. And at the center of it all stood Aaron. He had entered her life as a quiet man from a young world. He had been mocked by her nobles, doubted by her generals, dismissed by her council. Yet again and again he had shown them something they could not ignore. He had guided them through shadows, through fire, and through battles they should have lost. He had revealed a kind of strength that was not written in bloodlines or carved into monuments. That evening, Nira called for a gathering in the grand hall. The chamber was vast, lined with banners of gold and silver and filled with voices of leaders from across the empire. Generals, ministers, nobles, and envoys gathered, their eyes fixed on the throne. They expected orders, perhaps plans for the next war. What they did not expect was the queen's voice carrying across the hall, with words that shook the foundations of their belief. "Our empire has stood for centuries because of strength," Nira began. "Strength of armies, strength of command, strength of will. But strength alone does not keep an empire alive. Strength can break. Strength can be outmatched. We have faced an enemy that knows only hunger, and against them brute force nearly failed us. We survived not because of our power, but because of a gift that came from a world most of you dismissed." Her eyes turned to Aaron, who stood quietly at her side. The hall grew restless, whispers passing like wind. "This human," Nira said, her voice clear, "was called weak, fragile, unworthy. Yet it was his vision that saved us when the storm fell. It was his patience that gave us a path when we were blind. It was his courage that carried him into the heart of the swarm when many would have fled. He is not a symbol. He is not a decoration at my side. He is proof that greatness can rise from places the galaxy ignores." The chamber erupted. Some shouted in disbelief, others in agreement. The sound of voices rose until Nira's gaze silenced them again. Her eyes were sharp, her voice steady. "Do not mistake me. Design our empire will always be strong, but strength without wisdom is empty, and it is wisdom that humanity has brought us, a kind of wisdom born not from centuries of empire, but from surviving as the smallest among giants. That is what makes them dangerous. That is what makes them precious." The hall fell silent. Generals who had doubted Iran lowered their eyes. Ministers who had whispered against him shifted uneasily. For the first time, the empire's highest voices began to understand what their queen had seen. After the gathering ended, Nira and Aaron walked together through the palace gardens. The night air was cool and the stars stretched endless above them. For a time, they said nothing until Aaron spoke softly. "You risked much by speaking as you did. Many will not forgive it." Nira's eyes did not waver from the sky. A queen does not speak to be forgiven. A queen speaks to lead. They may resist now, but the truth cannot be hidden forever. They saw it in battle. They felt it in survival. And they will learn to accept it in time. Aaron was quiet. His steps were slow, his thoughts heavy. "I did not come here to be a leader. I only wanted to stand with you." She turned to him, her gaze strong yet warm. "And yet you became more. You showed them the human edge. You showed me that even a queen who believed she had seen all things still had more to learn. For that I am grateful." The bond between them, once doubted, had become something greater than either of them expected. What began as whispers of scandal had turned into the foundation of a new chapter in the Empire's history. Nira saw him not only as her consort but as her equal, and the galaxy itself would come to see humanity differently because of him. But the story did not end with words or honors. The Empire still faced the shadows of the swarm. Scouts reported strange movements at the edge of space, as if the enemy was gathering in silence. The war was not finished. It had only shifted into a new shape. When the council met again, Aaron stood with them, not as a guest but as a voice that could not be ignored. His ideas, once dismissed, were now discussed with care. Generals who had laughed at him now listened with respect. Soldiers across the empire spoke his name as they prepared for the battles to come. For humanity, still a small and scattered people, his place at the Queen's side became a light of hope. Stories reached Earth of the man who stood with the Xenar Queen, of the victories he had helped shape. For the first time, humans were not spoken of as fragile wanderers, but as bearers of a spirit the galaxy could not crush. One night, when the palace was quiet, Aaron stood again on the balcony overlooking the stars. Nira joined him, her presence steady as always. "Do you ever miss your world?" she asked. He was silent for a moment before answering. "Yes, Earth was small, but it was home. Yet when I look at the stars now, I feel something greater. I feel that perhaps my place was never meant to stay in one world. Perhaps my place was here, with you, with this empire, in this fight." Her hand rested gently on his arm. "Then you are where you are meant to be. And together we will face whatever comes." The stars stretched endless before them. Somewhere in the dark, the swarm still waited. But for the first time, Nira felt that the empire had more than armies, more than fleets, more than power. It had something the swarm could never understand. It had a human spirit standing at its heart. When the histories of the Xenar Empire would one day be written, scholars would tell of Queen Nira's strength, of her armies and her victories. But they would also tell of the human she chose, the man who showed them that survival was not only in strength, but in the will to adapt, endure, and rise again. The galaxy had always measured power by weapons, fleets, and empires. Now it began to measure it in another way, in patience, in vision, in the quiet fire that humanity carried. And in that moment, as the Queen and her human husband stood beneath the endless stars, the future of both their peoples changed forever.